Hi, I'm Tessa Arcilia. In Choices and Chances, I use my own style of interviewing, honed through decades as an international news presenter and correspondent, to delve into a new topic each week and interview some of the most inspiring people in the world. Life is a series of choices, choices that give us chances to live our best lives. My goal is to turn the wisdom of people I talk to and lessons from my own experiences into ideas you can use. So if you'd like to be inspired by other stories, hit the subscribe button and join the community.
Caroline, thanks so much for joining today. And it's really great to see you. And as I said earlier, it took a podcast to catch up with friends, which is not a great thing, but I'm so happy to see you. So thanks for
I'm so happy to see you. And also, Tessa, I feel like we should say that like you and I have never met in real life, which is so funny.
Actually, don't feel that.
That's what I was reflecting on this before we sat down, and when I was like putting the two urchins to bed and like just sort of, trying to collect my thoughts and thinking, what do I want to talk to Tessa about? And like, she's so interesting and she has so many wonderful opinions and you've got such a great vantage on so many aspects of life. And I was thinking, oh my God, like I have this amazing professional friendship with this wonderful person and we've never met in real life. And it's just so funny what it feels like a very, very perfect like 2024 friendship. So I love that about us. But I also at one point we will have cocktails in real life as opposed to me in my pajamas.
I will be joining you.
Yeah. Oh yeah. As opposed to me in my pajamas having like a cocktail because it's like nearly 10 o'clock at night here.
It is pretty amazing. So just for background, we met when we had our jobs for an American network, and you were based in the US and I was in Europe. So I was in, where was I? Brussels and then London. And yes, we have never met, and how our lives have changed since then, because that was our careers were about to take off. I had that feeling that it was such a big gig for all of us. And you didn't have children at the time, right?
I didn't. And, what was so interesting is that, so we had this fantastic boss, when we were working for this American network, and she's gone on to be, this huge deal. She already was kind of a huge deal. And I remember that exact kind of anticipation that you're talking about, which is when we were talking about the job in like, end of 2019, basically. And she was talking about, it's going to be your poster, like your face next to, these like storied, news anchors that have been around for forever and that, you and I both kind of respect and have been like in the field, prize winners, that kind of thing. And I think you're right. It did feel like we were on the cusp of this amazing thing. And I actually, we everything shut down, obviously, March of 2020. I had found out I was pregnant just before the whole world collapsed. And I was having this dilemma at the time about, oh my goodness, we're about to start this brand new job. You and I were going to be part of this big launch in the June of 2020. And I was having this sort of existential like crisis about like, oh my God, and I've just found out I'm pregnant. How do I tell my very, very fantastic female employer, but nonetheless like a badass boss who wants to launch something new, I'm pregnant, and actually the launch date is probably going to mean that I'm only there for a few months before I have to get maternity leave. And so there was a lot sort of wrapped up with that kind of moment in time. And then obviously everything kind of exploded and yeah.
But that must have been such a difficult position to be in, because when you find out you're pregnant, that's positive. You just got married at the time as well, didn't you? So that was positive news, and then you have a new job, and then but then how are you meant to feel when something like that happens?
Well, what's so interesting, and I don't know if you found this as well, but everything kind of paled, I was extremely anxious, and I think that there is so much about that sort of is symptomatic of the systemic way that society treats women and women in career, and that kind of tension between women and motherhood, and if you want to choose it or not choose it, or however it manifests, whether it's your own children, stepchildren, however that looks, family dynamics in general butting up against career is just something that has got so many systemic problems and anxieties around it, because particularly here in the United States, we don't have a very positive attitude and a very supportive attitude towards that kind of chapter in someone's life. You know, like personal life and professional life really do sort of seem to kind of butt against each other. In a way that, say, for example, like a Scandinavian country like Sweden, right? Everyone holds up Sweden, but those nations that sort of have inbuilt support systems so that, you know, if you want to be a person who is a professional and also a parent, there are mechanisms in society to help support that. But yeah, I mean, I was very, very anxious. I didn't need to be, because our fantastic boss was wonderful about it, and you know, in hindsight it was fine. But yeah, I was like freaking out. I was thinking, shit, like this is going to be the biggest thing of my life, and like how am I going to navigate this? And I was going to be a morning show anchor, so I was like trying to do the math in my brain about like, okay, so the baby's going to be sleeping then, and then I'm going to be sleeping, and then I'm going to be awake, and then I'm going to be on air, and how's that going to work? And then obviously when COVID happened and the sheer sort of, you know, the global change that happened because of the pandemic and how serious it was. And, you know, the two of us, we were, you know, really on the front lines covering it. You very much out there covering it. I was covering it pregnant, holed up in a New York City apartment. But the anxiety around, like, you know, we all thought we were going to die. And it's just weird even reflecting on that, like the collective PTSD we all sort of have, whether we know it or not, about the fact that like we were literally concerned that the very air we were all breathing was somehow going to like kill one another. I mean, you know, I don't know how you felt when you were in Brussels, but like certainly in New York City, the anxiety was so intense. Add on top of that being pregnant, add on top of that having this kind of, you know, major job. And yeah, it was like a very stressful time. And I was somebody who was privileged, right? Like I wasn't a frontline worker. I wasn't somebody who was in a hospital. The anxieties for those kind of people are just even so much more acute. But yeah, I mean, it was a kind of crazy time.
It was, and it's very strange because I almost forgot that bit. Like you forget the length of time that it was over 2 years, and
Mm-hmm.
it felt like everything was on hold. And now here we are looking back at it. It doesn't have the same weight. What I felt then was so heavy and grave. And for some reason, I look back and I can't access those feelings anymore as easily as I thought I would. But I don't
Mm-hmm.
know if you've just collectively moved on, or it's that's how you deal with PTSD, or with that kind of traumatic experience, you just move on from it and try not to think about it.
Yeah, I mean, I do think it's trauma, and I also think that there is a very sort of like clear delineation for, I think if everybody is honest with themselves, pre-COVID and post-COVID, and certainly for me, and something I sort of reflect on a lot as a as a as a woman, as a working woman, as now a woman who is a mother as well, and sort of like have all these different hats, is that my identity before COVID is just, there's just a whole different like human, like pre-COVID me and what I was able to be doing and just my life, my lifestyle, all of these things is just so different post-COVID. You know, like before COVID, I didn't have any children. I was, you know, about to move to London for this fancy job and was very much just sort of a, you know, relatively newlywed. Like it was me, my partner, my husband, and we were just like living life large, right? Like, you know, felt like very much like early 30s, like, you know, everything was rosy. I'm sure at the time I bitched and griped about all sorts of sort of banal shit, but yeah, I think that, you know, there's that element of everything's fine. And then post COVID, I mean, like my life is just so different. We've gone through, you and I both went through like redundancies, like the media sphere, like journalism in and of itself has undergone so many schisms, and you know, our profession has had so many knocks, and I think that millennial journalists have gone through the ringer in so many ways. Millennials in general have gone through the ringer in so many ways, but I, you know, kind of coming out of COVID, being a mother, somebody who was in charge of her own destiny in a sense of, I was a freelancer, I was like, you know, my own boss, and I have now 2 children. Like, I mean, it's just such a different life, you know, and the same for you, right?
Absolutely. And as you said, family comes in different forms. So I have stepchildren, and it's instantaneous. There's no preparation for it, because one day they're not there, and the next day 2 of them are there, and they're a certain age, and you have to fit into a family that existed before you were around. So I think, yeah, that's a very interesting dynamic, and it changes you. And the same way that motherhood from having your own children does. So I wanted to get into that. How did it change you? Did, as you know, a lot of mothers would say, everything else paled in comparison to that. Was that what happened with you? How did you change?
That's a really good question, particularly that framing about sort of like, does everything pale in comparison? If I'm truly honest, I'd say no. You know, like I think that my children are amazing and have impacted me, will continue to impact me in profound ways. But I think that sort of my purpose for being in this world and sort of what I think I'm supposed to be doing here is not necessarily just raising these two wonderful children, as very important as that job is. And I don't think that, I'm not trying to diminish that in any way. And it is a job, whether or not people want to, you know, like there are some fantastic people like Modarresy-Tehrani, who sort of advocates for things like the Marshall Plan for mums, and like, you know, much more of a sort of formalized recognition of the work of parenting. And like you and I both just said, that parenting takes different forms. I don't want to be sort of so heteronormative about it, but however that parenting looks, we should be doing a lot more to recognize, to celebrate pay, you know, whether or not that is like cash in hand so that people can utilize that in whatever ways they see fit, whether it's to buy food or buy clothes or like experiences for their children, whatever it is. But I still feel very much like me, Caroline, as a person who wants to be able to, you know, be the best journalist I can be. And, you know, however that looks and, you know, whatever that sort of ends up being, I really do feel like my sort of reason for being here has grown, as opposed to just the focus shifting onto this one new thing in my life, you know. But I think that, and I don't know if you find this as well, Tessa, but just the anxiety around, or pondering about sort of how one holds space for it all. I think that's the challenging thing that I've found, that by necessity, particularly because my children are young, they're, you know, 8 months and 3 years old, the demand and the focus that I have to, and I want to put on them, has meant that I just have less space and less time to be thinking about myself, my career, how I want to engage in civil society and discourse. And I think that that's something that I didn't anticipate. I don't think anyone can really fully appreciate what it's going to be like until you've had kids, which is a very cliche answer. It's like, you don't know until you know. But I think that there's an element of truth in that, because you can't possibly fathom what it means to have to sort of put these other two beings, or however many beings, ahead of your own needs and wants and desires.
I think that's a really interesting way of putting it, because you know your responsibility as a mother by putting their needs above certain things that you would like to do for yourself, perhaps if they didn't exist, yet at the same time recognizing that your identity is not linked to just being a mother. You know, that's one of the many things that make you who you are. It's an interesting juxtaposition of those two ideas, because you do have to make choices. As you say, we can't have it all at once. I think we can have it all in life, perhaps, but at different stages, because there's just 24 hours in a day. There's no way you can fit everything in. It's just basic maths. But then the choices that you're making now, have you had to make difficult choices?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, you know, most recently I was interviewing with a very, very prestigious news organization, and I won't say which one, but, you know, we were having lengthy conversations, going back and forward. They offered me a job. It would be another one of those kind of game-changing jobs, career elevating jobs. And I had to, at this current moment in my life, turn it down. And part of that was the nature of this particular gig and the hours it was going to mean that I was going to be working. A lot of it was going to be at night and overnight, some of it. And I have these wonderful babies, and particularly the youngest, who's 8 months, is just not a sleeper, and, you know, is also wouldn't take a bottle. And we've worked with lactation consultants and sleep consultants, and we've done all the things, you know, like you kind of, you know, I think that I have approached motherhood with the kind of same zeal as I approach like storytelling and journalism, which is like you research the shit out of it, right? Like sometimes to your own detriment. But, you know, it's like I've gone on every Instagram like rabbit hole about these things. But ultimately, I had to sort of make that call. And again, I don't want to say that this, you know, we know fantastic journalists who have young children and who are out in the field. Like I think about Clarissa Ward, and, you know, she had recently had young children. You know, I think she had a new baby as well at some point during the pandemic, and, you know, she was out in the field. I think this was sort of in the context of when the Ukraine war broke out, and I saw her kind of within a few months of giving birth, going back out in the field. And she's phenomenal, and she's someone I respect a great deal. And I think that was the right choice for her. And I think that's great. And I want to support and applaud women for any choice they make. Reflecting on my own situation and this kind of current moment for me, my family, it wasn't the right choice for me to make. But that comes with a lot of baggage. I mean, like, you know, in aside from the sort of the financials of like, okay, can I afford not to take a job? I also had to factor in like childcare costs, which have gone up. I think I want to make sure I get the statistics right for you, but the average daycare fees went up 6% globally in 2023 from the previous year. And in the US, childcare costs, daycare costs jumped by 9%. And, you know, there isn't universal pre-K across the United States. Like only, I think it's like DC, Florida, Oklahoma, Vermont, Wisconsin. This is according to the National Institute for Early Education Research. They're the only states that actually fully offer universal pre-K programs. And so it's constantly sort of like a mathematical puzzle, you know, when you're thinking about, can I work? Can I afford the childcare to afford myself to work? You know, I had to kind of weigh all of that stuff up. And so, yeah, I had to make those choices. And there is anxiety around it. And I don't know if you feel this way sometimes too, but, you know, you can get in your own head about things and think, is this my moment? You know, is this the shot? Am I going to look back and think, oh, if only I had whatever, made a different decision? But I also think like you can't think that way. Like you have to sort of tell yourself like, this is what I'm doing right now for my family. This is the best I can do in this moment and with the information I have. And I'm a hustler and I'm going to make something else happen. And that's going to be, you know, what I have to do next. And I just have to think about a different way and a more creative way of doing that. But it's tough. What about you? I mean, like,
It's really tough because people, I think, with making decisions, that's why a lot of people sit on the fence. It's because you don't want to deal with the opportunity cost of choosing one over another. It's just, and it's nice to have the choice. So that moment, sometimes in my head, I freeze that moment that I had those two choices, that it could have gone either way. And then you have to make that choice, right? But then, as you say, you just have to think to yourself, you made the right decision at the moment, that the best decision for you at that moment with the information you had. Otherwise, you're going to drive yourself nuts. And I think that's it with making decisions. If you made a mistake, then course correct.
Well, I think as well that, you know, there was this interesting survey done by CNBC and SurveyMonkey, and they kind of, you know, looked at women, and there was this sort of tension between ambition and career advancement. And so like 88% of women that were surveyed said that they were ambitious, but only 20% said that their career advanced in the past year. This was a survey that was conducted earlier this year. And a lot of that had to do with the machinations of support for women, particularly women of you know, childbearing age and people who have kids. And so it's sort of like, it's interesting, like my ambition has not changed as a mother, like, right? So like the ambition, the zeal, the desire is still very much there. But the factors around my life and what I have to kind of take into account when I'm making a decision has changed. And that is a difficult sort of square to circle.
Yeah, and I think I sent you that Economist link on the percentages, the numbers on when men have children, it pretty much stays stable on the same line where their careers are at. And then for women, obviously it takes a big drop and then never really gets back to that point. I mean, I'm sure it happens to some, but generally. And my question is equality about a 50-50 split? So what is real equality?
I'll go back to saying something that you and I talked about before, which is that like moving away from a heteronormative cisgender kind of framework, right? Like however you come to be a parent, it looks different. It doesn't necessarily mean 9 months and then you're a parent. It can be overnight, like for you, right? Like it's like you're all of a sudden a mother and you're a parent, or you're a bonus mother, or however. What do they call you? Have you got like a name?
Well, they just call me my name, but they call me their stepmom.
The stepmom. Okay. Right. So like I had a bonus mom, the stepmom, like there's different ways of like, you're an important person in their life. But in terms of what equality looks like, that's a really good question. I think, okay, so it's taking a step back. I'm very lucky. I have a very supportive partner. Not everybody does. And I think I'm very fortunate to have married like my best friend and somebody who's extremely passionate and supportive about my career. To the point where, he's constantly saying like, you've got to put your mask on before others. Like, he's very sort of almost like overzealous sometimes, where he's like, I know they're, like they want, they're calling for mommy, but like you need to like, whatever it is, shower or some other basic human need that I'm like pee. Like the number of times I'm like, what was I going to say I was going to be doing? And it's like 5 hours later and I'm like, oh yeah, urinate, like a basic thing. I'm sure other parents can relate, but so I think that, I have sort of philosophical equality in my relationship, which is wonderful. And then how that manifests in sort of the real world is that my partner's job hasn't really changed. His job is the same. He absolutely has made sacrifices. He takes time out of his work day. He is very much sort of like trying to help me when and where he can. So I was the breadwinner for the longest time in our relationship. Like ever since my partner and I met, he's in the nonprofit sector and I was in the private sector. And so I was always the breadwinner. And then all of a sudden we had children and I became kind of a freelancer and my own boss, which was wonderful in a lot of ways because I could dictate my schedule around our child. We had one child at the time when this was all sort of happening. But then, and I still managed to be the breadwinner. But this past year, when we had our second child, things have definitely shifted. So my husband has sort of taken on that role, and I have been trying to maintain a semblance of my professional life, but also now we have another young child, and it's sort of juggling the two things. I don't know what it would mean to have true equality. I think part of the missing piece, particularly here in the United States, is the childcare desert situation. It's onerously costly. People got burned out during COVID, understandably. We treat teachers and we treat educators like garbage in this country. We don't pay them accordingly. There was a fantastic op-ed, and I can't remember who wrote it, but there's a piece about like we should be paying teachers $100,000 minimum. Absolutely, like they're raising the leaders of tomorrow, and yet we treat teachers shoddily and they're barely scraping by. So I think that to kind of reach true equality, to answer your question fully, is that we need to have these systemic changes. Like power dynamics in a relationship are one thing. Power dynamics within the structural makeup of a nation are something else. And I don't think that it's been adequately tackled, by whatever administration you want to hold the yardstick against, whether it's been, the previous Republican administrations or this current Democrat administration. I don't think it's been addressed properly. Which is why I really love what women like Modarresy-Tehrani are doing, where they are trying to kind of like scream, you know, she would phrase it as screaming that this is a major issue, and it's an economic issue, because if you don't have, like you mentioned that, you know, fantastic Economist article, the longer you bar women entry to the workforce or allow them to stay in the workforce, you are hurting your economy as a country, right? Like, I mean, it's just a thing. And, you know, we know that more than 2 million women were pushed out of the workforce in COVID, and that hasn't really recovered. Like, women are working less today than in 2019. And that's according to ADP. So, like, it's these systemic issues, I think, that are leading to these inequalities. But I want to kind of come back to something you'd said, Tessa, about like just the sort of the mentality around it all as well. And like, I think it's fascinating, and I'd love your take on this, is this idea of hustle culture and like the girl boss culture that we sort of came of age in terms of our professional coming of age, right? Like, I think that, you know, between the ages of like 25, 35, we were at this sort of like very core moment where there was this rise of the girl boss concept, and it was sort of riffing in a more hardcore way on the idea of like women can have it all. And then, of course, Sheryl Sandberg's infamous like Lean In manifesto. How do you feel when you reflect on the idea of like the girl boss? Because it's obviously, it's like having its moment now where people are sort of rebuking it and sort of deeply questioning this sort of, you know, drink that we were all sort of forced to like glug in these formative moments. But like, how do you view the girl boss idea?
Look, there are positives, and obviously now you've got the questioning of concepts, and I think we make that swing in every big movement, right? We go extremely one way, extremely the other, and find that middle ground. First of all, I think I work in a very female dominated company, and I think it's great to have those women who are able to lead companies. But when I talk to my boss and I say, I don't know how you do it, and she says, well, I have a husband who stays at home. So there is that person who is able to do the childcare. So in any situation, I think we can have it all, but not all at the same time. It's just, as I said, there's just not enough time in a day to be able to do all these and to be able to give everything, give your 100% in every pursuit. And I think it is not very constructive to force one absolute idea on anyone, whether it's choosing motherhood, taking a pause from your career, or choosing a career and being that I'm doing everything. I know people in my life who project that, like, I'm doing everything. I'm an amazing mom and an amazing career woman. And that's amazing. That's great. But then we sit down for coffee and have that one-on-one friendship talk. And it's not always what you see. So it is always, the reality is there's always that juggle. And I think if you put that pressure on, what image should I be projecting? Because this is what is cool now. This is what value, what was that value signaling? This is what we should be aiming for. Then I think that is the pressure that we shouldn't be putting on ourselves. And I think we should just make decisions that are best for us. Like even the decision you made about a job, like, it might not sit well with another person who goes, oh my God, what are you doing, Caroline? You just wasted an opportunity. So yeah, I don't think we can do it all at once, just because we always need help. We always need that society. We need a supportive boss. We need a supportive partner. If we want to fulfill all those roles. I don't know. That's just for me. I don't want to put pressure on myself anymore.
I think that that's a great way of thinking about it, though. And also just sort of, do you feel, I mean, I guess, do you have any bitterness or resentment to this idea that we were fed? I mean, like, there's so many things. What is it? There was that meme going around. It's like, you wouldn't have survived in like the zoo that raised me or whatever. And it's like people posting like, you know, I worked at another sort of very scrutinized media company, let's say, that was kind of known for a lot of its like bro kind of culture practices, and a lot of people jumped on this meme that I knew that had worked there as well, and like were posting pictures of the headquarters and being like, you wouldn't have survived, like, you know, in the zoo that raised me, or like the asylum that raised me, or whatever it is. And I think that I'm curious, like, if there's like any kind of resentment around, like, you know, we were also kind of came of an age of Bridget Jones's Diary, and that's sort of like, you know, oh my God, I weigh 9 stone, like I'm obese. And like, just like the crazy tropes. Like we went through like 90s heroin chic, and like I just feel like millennials like had it hard, man. Like we're our first generation that like, you know, is making kind of less than our parents and are less likely to be homeowners. And this sort of trajectory that I think that, you know, when we were 10, 11, 12, 13, you know, even though to kind of early adolescence, there was this idea of like, we're going to go up, 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 up. Like, right. It's like, everything is going to just be keep going up, because that's what happened to our parents, and like, you know, whatever they bettered from the generation. And then it's just been like nonstop. I mean, like the financial crisis that we all kind of went through really since 9/11. It's like, you know, 2001 and 2008-9, the financial crisis, and then, you know, COVID, 2020. And I'm just curious, like, do you feel like a sense of like resentment about all of that, or like are you just like, I mean, you're always such a sunny person, but yeah.
I'm going to throw the question back at you because I'd like to know if you feel any resentment, but I don't think resentment is the word it is the right word, because I don't feel angry. I just think I see myself as an observer of the world of cultures. And it's funny though, I think there is a generational gap, not just between us and the people that came before us, but the juniors now, the younger people, they just see the world in a completely different way. As you say, some people, and I heard this from my parents, so, oh, you wouldn't have survived what we went through. And I think it's just how generations talk to and at each other. But I think there are people and societies and pockets of society that will always sound holier than thou and tell you that you're not doing the right thing. Oh my goodness. And I have just learned to shut that down and think that's about you, not me. That's You're projecting something, and that's on you, and that's okay. You're free to do that. And people will impose their ideas on you. And I think it's just important to have the tools to know that you control your own perception of yourself. It took me a while to get there. I don't think I would have spoken like this like 10 years ago. I was so obsessed with my career, right? And obsessed about being that the girl who can do everything.
Yeah.
I don't know. Do you feel resentful?
No, I think that there is a sense of kind of what you were saying about like the coming to terms with a lot of things, right? Sort of like what we were told was going to be the way it was going to be was never going to be the way it was going to be. And understanding that like there was a lot of hyperbole and there's a lot of rhetoric, and ultimately you sort of, you know, you do what you can with what you have in the moment. And that line that you just sort of said about sort of like, that's, you know, it's always about other people as opposed to yourself. Like I had this great line from my therapist who's like, that's their work. You know, like you have to just sort of stop and be like, oh no, that's their work. And I can't do their work for them. I can only do my work. But I do think that, you know, kind of coming back to what our roles are and that sort of tension between career and motherhood and sort of being a person in the world that is looking after littles as well. Knowing that you now have to impart some sort of like standard and wisdom for very, very vulnerable people who are little sponges, that is a huge responsibility. And I think that I definitely have tried to catch myself and stop myself from perpetuating anything that I find like distasteful about the norms that we were made to consume, or that we, you know, the paradigms that we were raised in. And I think that sort of having those moments where, okay, I'm going to speak differently, or I need to make sure that I'm centering the right aspect of this experience for my child so that, you know, she takes on this mentality, because this is really the groundwork we're laying for their prosperity and their self-esteem and how they're going to view the world. I think that sort of, you know, that feels like a huge responsibility. And I think that it does make you stop and think about like, wait, what do I want from my career? And what really is important? And is being the person that goes viral the most important thing? And I don't think it is. You know, I don't really think it was, but I think that there's definitely, you know, I think like 10 years ago, like 9 years ago, I went viral for an interview that I did, you know, and it sort of went around the world quite literally. And I felt an element of sort of elation around that virality, but also anxiety. And now I think that whenever I post anything that does go viral, I far feel more anxious than elated. The anxiety around being just amplified globally for something you've done has a lot more anxiety around it for me personally, which is difficult because I think our current industry really functions around algorithms and clicks and, you know, journalists as brands and things like that. And that's very different to how you and I entered the profession. And I think we've had to do a lot to try, you know, it's like a lot of mental jujitsu to try and make yourself feel comfortable. And I really applaud like younger generations who seem much more like adept and fine with doing it. And certainly I'm not trying to make us sound like ancient people, but I do think that it's very different now than it was when you and I were starting out.
Someone at work said to me, for someone who is quite quiet in real life, it's quite surprising that I'm in this industry. But for me, what you see on camera is it's a performance part of it, right? Like I remember when I auditioned for that job that we had, and I just don't. I'm an introvert. I just don't feel the need to be the big personality in the room. I like one-on-one conversations. I like this. I like connecting that way. That's just my way. And then camera rolls, and I'm just doing my job. I'm reporting, and then I saw their faces. So, you know who we worked with, and he was like, "Oh, where did that come from?" And it's just I struggled with the public nature of our work, but then knowing that being public is what gets these stories out and what you need. So I actually don't know the answer. I just kind of have that in my head all the time. So even this podcast or putting myself out there, it stresses me a lot because I don't like being public but then you have to be. And then it looks like when you look at my social media or that it comes easily. If I could have the same impact without being public, I would, but I don't think that there's a way to do that yet. So yeah, it is more anxiety inducing. Although that said, yes, it's nice when people see your work and receive it well because you've put a lot of effort into the stories that you're telling, right? It's why we do what we do. If it changes something,
For
then great.
sure. I think that the impact element and knowing that sort of like, you know, I remember doing a lot of work. I'm very interested in healthcare journalism and reporting, and particularly reporting around disability and disability rights and things like that. And, you know, there's always kind of an element of exhilaration when you see a piece that you reported on having some kind of impact in the zeitgeist, you know, whether it's about policy and dialogue and advancing certain kinds of policies, or as you mentioned, just sort of the basics of like shining a light on and, you know, a marginalized group or a group that is experiencing injustice, right? Like I think part of the reason we're in the profession we're in is we have highly tuned justice meters. You know, it's something that I personally inherited from my mother. Like it's just the idea of injustice gets our sort of blood boiling, and I think that kind of fuels our zeal and wanting to kind of pursue stories. I think the viral, I think there's a difference between like your work being seen and discussed and there's kind of a discourse around it to like work that then just is like goes viral. And I've had this happen kind of, you know, truly twice where sort of something gets blown up to a point where there is so much scrutiny. And, you know, I've had death threats and rape threats and all sorts of things as a result of a story or an interview that I've done. And it's that element, I think, of the work that I find really unsettling. So I think that's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about like the sort of viral nature. But then there's this sort of weird tension between like what fuels algorithms these days and like, you know, if you open up whatever social media platform you're scrolling through, you're more likely to see, because this is just how algorithms function, you're more likely to see work that is in some way incendiary and polarizing because people are going to be more likely to engage with that work. And then that engagement is driving traffic, and that traffic is sort of feeding the algorithm, and then the vicious cycle goes on. And I think that that is something that our industry is still trying to grapple with, and trying to, trying to understand how we move forward. And Maria Ressa is amazing about this, right? Like Nobel Peace Prize winning, journalist, famous for sort of continuing to report, even though she was threatened with imprisonment, and this was in the Philippines under the their President Duterte. But information is sort of really like power these days, more so than ever else. And like our information ecosystem, she talks about this very eloquently, has been kind of corrupted, and whether that corruption has kind of come from ceding a lot of journalism over to private social media companies that don't have any accountability aside from really shareholders. But the sort of tension between that and then misinformation, and how our news diets have become more fractured, and what one person's consuming as fact is not the same as this person over here is consuming as fact anymore. Like, I just think that we're again kind of wrestling with all of this as journalists, and as anybody who interfaces with a media company. I don't know how you feel about that.
We do exist, and people exist in echo chambers, and I think that's why it's so important to just get out and read what you don't necessarily agree with, just to know what thoughts are out there, because you don't want to invalidate those thoughts as well, because that's exactly what happens, I think, in elections. We go, oh, if you think that way, you're stupid, the treatment of each other shouldn't be that way, and it's amplified online because you can choose what you listen to. And to your point about the anxiety over the coverage, because when I started covering politics, no matter what you say, what you do, they watch one package, one story, which might have included this particular voice because that was the point of the story. But then what about the 10 other voices? Oh, you didn't cover this. Well, because you didn't see the 10 other stories. But you can't really respond to all of that. I'm sorry to hear you've had those threats, but it's, accusations for me personally, of, oh, you're a spy for this country and this country. I'm like, well, it seems like I'm spying for all countries. Isn't that
You're very talented, Tessa. You're very talented.
Wow, that's amazing.
You can be a multi spy. Like, I have faith that you're that talented. You could be, triple agent.
Well, first of all, we said you are very sensitive to injustices, just like I am. This is the reason why we went into this field, and it really affects me when I see an injustice and you want to do something about it. And then you balance it with, well, what is my role in the story? I am telling the story. So where do you put yourself when it comes to, you're supporting a specific cause or philosophy or, human right in a story, but you also are a journalist, and there are certain guidelines that we need to adhere to as journalists. So where do you put yourself in that spectrum?
Oh, that's such a good question, Tessa. It's such a good question. That's why you do what you do. So ask really good questions. No, you do though. And I think it's really, I think that this is, I think this is something that probably keeps most journalists up at night, particularly in this current moment and current climate, for a couple of reasons. One is that, again, the ecosystem of journalism and the kind of the way that people interact with journalism has changed so much. And I think that people tend to follow journalists or like particular kind of brands much more readily, perhaps, and engage with those brands more readily than an outlet, like a journalistic outlet. So, people might not necessarily, I think that, I don't have the exact data on this, but I know there is sort of statistics out there about sort of Gen Z, for example, are more likely to get their news from things like TikTok than they will be from legacy media companies. It's not to say they're not seeing the journalism from that legacy media company, but it's probably that they follow so-and-so journalist on TikTok, and that journalist is associated with that media company. And so they're kind of by osmosis getting, interfacing with that media company, but they're more likely to be following a brand. And so then you have to kind of see yourself as a brand, right? And which I'm not very good at doing. Like it's not something that kind of comes naturally to me. There's sort of like a whole work aspect around cultivating your brand and like putting yourself out there and doing all this stuff, which, I don't want to diminish anybody that is fantastic at doing that, because it's a full-time job and I wish I were better at it. But again, it's not the journalism that I grew up with, and it's not the journalism that I kind of entered into, and it doesn't come naturally to me. I'm a big personality, but it doesn't necessarily mean that I wanted to kind of like my personality to lead the way when it came to my journalism. I'd always rather the story speaks for itself. And then I'm happy to comment on the story, but like I want the story to be the sort of front and center focal point. And I think that that has sort of shifted over time, in part because the way that media companies are funded have shifted so radically, right? Like we've become more reliant, and I say we as big tent journalism, on private sources of funding. Advertising models really never recovered from pre-social media ages and things like that. So like there's just a whole like kind of can of worms. But I'm trying to think back to, there was like another point I was going to make. Tell me the question again. I'm like trying to like remember now what we were just saying. Brands. Oh, brands. Yeah. Right. Brands as journalists. So I think that there's like that element is difficult. And then the other thing is coming back down to how do we respond in this moment? Christiane Amanpour has a strapline, which is truthful, not neutral. And that is sort of how I see our role, which is that my job isn't to be neutral. And, there are a lot of different subjects we could take. In this current, political moment in 2024, I'll use climate change, which I think is a good example, which is that 5 years ago, 10 years ago, it was sort of not even just acceptable, but like expected that if you're going to have a panel about climate change, you'd probably have somebody who was like a climate change denier, for example, or someone who's extremely skeptical about the science, and then somebody who was, much more a proponent of the science that says that human beings are affecting the planet and, contributing to the warming of the planet, and that is having detrimental effect on our environment. Fast forward to 2024, I think people would think you were nuts if you had somebody who was on a panel who was like a climate change skeptic or a denier. Absolutely, I'm not saying that we should squash debate, and I'm not saying that, science shouldn't be scrutinized. Science in and of itself is a verb. It's constantly changing, as you and I saw very, very profoundly with COVID, right? Like, you don't have to wear masks at the beginning. Oh, actually, you do have to wear masks. Like, you and I both know how quickly a story can change. However, I think that to be truthful and not neutral about something like climate change, for example, is that I'm not going to pretend that I don't have some kind of viewpoint. I'm not going to be neutral when it comes to this, because an overwhelming scientific body of evidence shows that human beings are affecting the global warming of the planet, and that warming is having a detrimental effect to our weather patterns, and those weather patterns are unfortunately impacting usually marginalized communities and poorer communities before anyone else, right? So that is sort of the benchmark I have in my mind when I'm approaching certain stories. And then you kind of extrapolate from there, right? Like you could put that onto any of the many, many, many atrocities that are happening around the world. And I think that if you come back to that idea of truthful, not neutral, hopefully you're not steered wrong. I don't know what you think.
Yeah, I think with the examples that you've given, and also some of the things going on in the world, there are factual accounts. And we can't, even with studies, even with clinical trials, medical, it's always a sample, right? So you can't say in absolute terms, this is absolutely what everybody in this or X% in the world thinks. So we have to understand that research is that way. But as you say, with climate change or certain events in the world now, there are certain facts, observations, recordings of things that we can look to as basis for whatever we think or feel of a situation. But how do you apply it to cultural perspective on issues? Because that our lived experiences will be completely different. So what this saying, I don't know who said it before, one's freedom fighter is another person's terrorist. So that is more difficult to navigate. So when I just report, I try to see, okay, what are the people who have a stake in the story? What are they saying? I recognize in my education, I was told who were the bad guys and who were the good guys. And I'm aware of that, right? And so I don't, in that context, I don't know really how to apply the truthful, not neutral. I don't, can we still apply that i-
I
in
think we
that
can.
setting?
I think that that's I think it's a great sort of question, and I think it's a great sort of thing to sort of take pause in. I do think we can. I think that, again, the truthful, not neutral means that if I'm not here to pass a judgment, right? Like, there doesn't have to be a judgment portion to the truthful, not neutral, right? That's not up to me to sort of necessarily pass a judgment. But I do think that we can be truthful in the sense of, I'm going to report on what I see. And this is why it's so important. And this is why, like, the Committee to Protect Journalists has been talking about, like, the chilling of reporting that's sort of been permissible around the world, right? Like, sort of press freedoms. The Committee to Protect Journalists has been talking about, like, the curtailment of press freedoms around the world. And I think that this is why it's so important that we continue to kind of hold journalism to a high standard, but not devolve into the media bashing that I see happen quite a lot, because I think that actually harms the ecosystem of journalism writ large. And that's really dangerous, because if we engage in this sort of low hanging fruit, like journalist bashing, it means that then the general public is less trustful of journalism and is going to look elsewhere for journalism. And then all of a sudden you have the rise of fringe personalities, being the people that feed, the diet of journalism and media to consumers. And that's not good, because that does foster silos. I think that the truthful, not neutral kind of adage when it comes to being judgment free does mean being on the ground. And so if you have countries that don't allow journalists in, or journalists to practice freely, like Russia as an example, which is one of many nations that is sort of chilling journalistic speech and the ability for journalists to report, I think that does have a detrimental effect. And I think that it's harder then to be the truthful, not neutral, because then that country can accuse you of bias because you're reporting outside of it and you're not, quote unquote, speaking to people on the ground. But so I think that there is an element of, like, getting as close to the story as possible allows you to continue to have that truthful, not neutral, but I'm not the judge philosophy. But it does require that you can get as close to the story as possible. And we are living in an age, and this current moment for journalists is really perilous. And when we don't have access to conflicts or countries, it means that our capacity to be able to do that is that much dampened. And I think that we societally are worse off as a result.
Yeah, and I think that there's a lot of people do ask me when I cover sensitive stories about, is there a bias? And I think majority of the people, our colleagues, we do the best we can with what we have. And I think there's a genuine desire to tell a story. For the people that I know and that I've worked with, there is a genuine desire, regardless of what your position is, from your own opinions of people or a situation, but you want to report as closely to what you see as possible. And I think you're right. It's a low hanging fruit to bash a journalist, and putting that, it's a tough one. We have these conversations in editorial meetings all the time. So where do you draw the line? Remember when we were covering Brexit or any election where it's such a polarized country? Then again, you can't, no, neither side can sit on a high horse and say, well, you are wrong and you are wrong, because people have different lived experiences that their truth might actually be true to them. And I was covering the outskirts of the UK before Brexit happened, and there was just so much anger against the EU at the time. Yet London was completely different. So, it doesn't make one opinion or the other invalid. But of course, I had my own opinion. Of course,
Right.
I have my own position. If I had to vote, I will vote a certain way. And so that's something that I think is always, I think it's just always part and parcel of the job, on how to make sure that we do our jobs as journalists, but also proportionally present stories. As you said, I think you're right with what is balance. What is it? It depends. If you have a David versus Goliath, then where is the balance there? Can you give them both 50-50? So it's case dependent. It's story dependent, I think.
I also think, though, and I don't know what you feel about this, but it's about the diversity in newsrooms. And, I think that particularly in this current climate, like DEI as a concept gets sort of I think, sometimes an unfair rap in terms of what people perceive it to mean. And I think that some of the best stories I've ever done have been in the auspices of newsrooms where there have been manifold lived experience and political opinion and the space where people felt comfortable enough to be able to, exercise that opinion. And my stories have always been richer for it. And I had a great producer, when I was working in the field for the good many years I was in the field as a national news correspondent. And she and I would have like sparring matches on airplanes. And like, I was also, like, full disclosure, like, fucking terrified of like these tiny planes, like the small planes where it's like, like one row and I'll just be like, oh my God, like I'm gonna die, like I can't even. Ugh. Like I would just like, there was not enough lorazepam in the world, and I would be sitting there and we'd be like writing our copy or writing our scripts, whatever. And she made me a better journalist because we would be like having these like, like I'd be like, well, of course we have to include this soundbite, and like, and they'd be like, well, why? Like, like what is that serving the story? How is that furthering a viewer's understanding of this story? Like, really holding someone to account. And it absolutely was because they came from a different cultural, political framework, maybe, or lived experience than I had. But thank God they did, because, like it made me a better journalist and it made me be able to be a better storyteller. And I think that I would hope anyway, I wish that there are more newsrooms that are like that instead of running away or sort of finding it problematic if people have a different viewpoint, that it's actually celebrated. And I do think part of the problem has been that with social media, if anyone does have a different viewpoint, they're shat on immediately. And it's sort of like the reign of like, awful terror kind of comes upon you if you deviate from a perceived sort of like norm. And that's for progressives or conservatives, right? Like I think it happens in both ways. There are these puritanical zealots that tend to rule the roost on social media platforms. And I hope that in real life, and particularly in newsrooms, that we do allow for more space and difference of opinion. And I'm not saying there isn't. I'm not trying to, again, bash journalism or bash media, but I do think that we would all do better sometimes to realize that because someone has a different take on it doesn't necessarily mean that they are like an inherently stupid or bad person. They just have a different take, and that's okay. And again, something to try and like, teach our kids, kind of full circle, coming back to motherhood, about like how are we teaching kids to engage in this world, particularly a world where it's like they're going to have to try and spot misinformation and AI. My God, like we haven't even talked about that existential idea, but like, yeah, I think that there's just a lot wrapped up in this notion of who gets to be the arbiter of fact and the judgment piece that you so eloquently sort of talked about, which is trying not to have that drive your thinking.
Yeah, because also, as you say, with the self-censorship, I think a lot of that it does happen a lot online. And I hope as well, like in newsrooms, so you have more robust discussions. But I wanted to add to your point of diversity in newsrooms. I don't know if you think the same way, but I've found that in yes, newsroom that I've worked at, most of the people come from a certain social class. One is because when you're starting off as a journalist, you have a lot of unpaid internships. And how many people can really have years of unpaid internships? Those that come from families that can support them, right? So there's also, I find, a class, a problem with that in social class, that you all draw from this part of society that has no exposure to a lot of experiences that another pocket of society might have. I don't know if, and I think that's an institutional change as well. If you start offering the payment paid internships rather than unpaid ones. It starts with that. I don't know, but did you find that a lot of the people that we worked with come from a certain educational background or social class background?
I definitely think that was true of management. I
Mm.
think that the people who are commissioning stories and the people who kind of get, for the most part, into those positions of leadership have tended to be, just again, in my experience, not trying to sort of like, speak for our entire profession, but certainly in the newsrooms I've had, there has been an element of, maybe more so when I was starting out, and maybe more so, to be honest, in the UK than here in the US. I think that there was certainly kind of like a classist zeal, which I didn't come from, right? Like I was a state school kid, who very much was. I definitely felt very out of place in a lot of newsrooms when I was starting out. I was lucky that I had gone to Oxford. I was one of the few state school kids that did. I was one of only 2 kids in my entire school that went to Oxbridge. And I'm glad I had that experience, because I was exposed to, in these formative years of, like 18, 19, 20, 21, to different classes of people, right? Like princes of countries were in my like dorm room situations, right? Like, I mean, so it was, I had exposure, and I also was raised, I have a fantastic mother who raised me to sort of like not be ever embarrassed or ashamed to be in any room, in any situation. She always told me that I was good enough to be in those spaces, and it didn't matter wherever I'd come from. I haven't, had an immigrant father as well. And so like to have somebody who was telling me that was so important, because then when it meant that I did go to newsrooms where there were these kind of certainly like kind of class dynamics, I didn't necessarily feel chastened by that, or sort of, made to sort of feel diminished in some way. I was definitely bricking it and like felt nervous in a lot of situations, but I didn't let it kind of overwhelm me. I don't think anyway. But yeah, I mean, I do think there's a barrier into. I totally did a bunch of unpaid internships, really sometimes really shitty ones, and like, where you were just sort of journalism adjacent. You were promised that you were going to be like, oh, you're going to be writing all summer and blah, blah, blah. And then you find out you're like bringing like biscuits to the editors or some nonsense, which I totally did and had to do when I was starting out. So yeah, but again, I think you're right. I think that there is sort of this holdover, less so because of, more startups. I think the startup culture, and certainly like the citizen journalism that is happening and that has been happening really since the Arab Spring uprising, right? 2011, I think, was a pivotal moment in the rise of the citizen journalist. And that has continued to sort of be something that's changed the landscape, particularly outside of the US. There are great citizen journalists here, but I think you see a lot more diversity around the world, because there are people that don't have, in theory, storied media organizations or press freedom, and so they are scraping for it and doggedly fighting for it in any way they can. And kudos to them, because they're doing it often in contexts that are just unfathomable. Yeah, I don't know if that like answered the question. I'm just like,
No,
like my brain now. I'm like, oh, is my brain like getting totally fried? I also like, I realized like I started this interview and I was like kind of like regular color, and like the stupid ring
now
light
I'm
is making me like
I
redder
know.
and redder. I have no
I'm
powder, so I'm like, I hope that you can like do something to this in terms
I'm
of edit, because I'm
always
like,
I'm so red. Like the one that I did with Helen, I said I'm so red. I always think about the guilt of having been lucky in the lottery of life. I think there's that, especially as a journalist, when I see injustice and you just go, oh, I know I shouldn't be guilty and I'm feeling guilty. It's not my fault, but you feel it. I don't know. Do you feel that guilt?
oh yeah, of course, all the time, and particularly, like with the current situation in the Middle East, and
Yeah.
and Ukraine and things like that. I mean, the images that come out, particularly, I'm looking at these images, I'm consuming these images, I'm consuming these this reportage that's coming out from, again, citizen journalists that are based on the ground in a lot of the time nations where you know press outlets are not being permitted. And I'm often doing this while I'm breastfeeding my baby, because breastfeeding is like its own full-time job. I think I calculated with my first, I spent over 450 hours breastfeeding her, and because I had this like obviously type A like tracking app that like I would track all the hours I was doing it, but often I'll be sitting in a quiet room nursing our youngest, and she's asleep and she's nursing, and I'm sitting there with the phone in hand, and I'm obsessively consuming news, and it's just really difficult not to have visceral reactions to what we are seeing around the world. And it sounds cliche to be like hug your babies even tighter, but there absolutely is luck, dumb luck, the lottery of life, you name it, whatever sort of hackneyed way we want to describe it, it's all true. Unfortunately, right, the stereotype is there because a lot of the times it's true. I mean, it's true. There is no reason why I am sitting in a quiet nursery with my child in the most comfortable, quiet, this is like her favorite place in the whole world, and she is nothing but the personification of safe in that moment. There is no reason why somebody else in another country, by virtue of a geography, should not be feeling the same way. And often it's women and children that are suffering. You name the conflict, it's usually women and children that are suffering, innocent women and children. And there's that awful adage about like boys and their toys, and I think that you see it from the playground, and then you see it in the political arena, and a lot of the time that sort of foolhardy, incendiary rhetoric that comes from mostly the male leaders in our world has led to that absolute imbalance and injustice. I'm not saying that there aren't women that perpetuate that and help prop up those systems, but absolutely women and children are more likely to be the recipients of and at the brunt end of policies dictated to by patriarchy in a way that is dangerous and diminishes their capacity to enjoy life and to thrive. And that inherent injustice is something that makes me angry and is the reason why I want to keep doing what I do. And is why I'm so glad that there are journalists like yourself that are continuing to do what you do, because it's fucking important. And you don't have to be working for a giant ass newsroom. You just have to care, and you have to be close enough to a story where you can be talking to the people, the stakeholders, the people who are involved, to try and shine a light on that story and hopefully make some kind of impact.
You took me right where I wanted to go with this, because for anyone who hasn't seen Caroline's work, go online, Google her. You will see incredible work that Caroline has done. Great interviewer. What are you planning next? What when you say I want to keep doing this, what are you going to do now in the context of you having to raise two little kids and not having all the time in the world as you did before? So what's next, and what are you doing now?
Well, so I just, first of all, thank you for having me on. And then just like to be able to see you is so wonderful, and spend like, some glorious time with you is wonderful. And you're someone whose work I've admired, for a long time and continue to admire. So I'm just so grateful to hear those lovely words as well. So it's so kind. I've just finished working on this great project that I was doing with The Atlantic, and we just did 5 seasons of a podcast, which was fantastic. And that's just finished, that's sort of wrapped relatively recently. And I'm sort of trying to develop some of my own things, and it's just trying to find the time and the space to be able to make sure that it's worth like kind of adding to the noise and the ecosystem, because it feels like there is so much out there. So I'm just sort of working with some great people at trying to develop spaces that I can interview people and bring certain stories to light. And so is it trite to be like, watch the space? I don't know. It's like that seems very sort of like vague and like not intentionally so. It's probably because I'm like tired and like have like been wrestling with the children. But yeah, I think all that to say is that like I don't have a very clear sort of sense of like how my work is going to manifest in this moment in time, but in part because my sweet youngest is still in a very specific kind of stage where she needs so much of me. But I'm just starting to sort of think, how will I be able to work in a way that allows me to continue to be the journalist that I want to be and work with fantastic people, because no one can do this alone. Like it's really fucking hard to be a solo practitioner, and particularly in our space, like we're starved for a human company. We like need each other to sort of make each other better. And so often I'm, struck with this idea of like, how can I report on what I know and also do it with great people? And I mean, like that's the sweet spot, right? Like if you can do what you love with people you admire and respect, like that's the dream. So
I know one thing that I had to look up and read about, and as you say, research to death before you start something, is are there too many people in this space and too many voices, and is there room for me? And I know as a philosophy, I know that there's room for everyone in this world to do what they want to do. I always believe that there's room for all of us to succeed. But I needed to see numbers. I needed to see some proof that I could do this. And it is still, I think there is room for content creation and creating your own community. The whole world is online now. And I think that gives me hope that whatever you want to put out, you will attract the people that, that share the values that you espouse. And hopefully those that also would like to hear something that they may not agree with. I think there's hope that people would get out of their echo chambers.
I hope so. I'm gonna cling to your hope. And I will also say as well, Tessa, just like the last thing to kind of put a bow on this in terms of where we started as well, which is that I'm so heartened by women supporting other women in a way that I think the generation above us it was just a lot more fractious. I think that it felt very much like you were the only woman in the room, or there was only one spot and it was only like one spot for a woman or something like that. And I love, and just like to give people insight into like our relationship as well, like, so Tessa and I have never met in real life, but we have had this like sustained relationship since we were first like introduced to one another, like 4 years ago now. And it is nothing but like, you're doing fantastically, and I'm not saying that's like without any kind of sense of quality control. It's just a sheer wanting to champion another fantastic woman and sort of be like, I'm so glad and I feel so grateful that we're in this moment where, what is it that there's like, it's not like there's like one slice of pie, like there's always more pie, right? Like, particularly in America, like you can get pie really big. So like there's always more pie. There's pie for everyone. But like, that sense of like, it doesn't have to be me elevating myself at the expense of you. It's about how can I champion you, because that doesn't in any way have any bearing about, my capacity to be the best version of myself. And so I just, again, to kind of like toot your horn for you and like, will always be your champion. And I think that I love that there is that space, I think that that's something that I cherish, and I cherish you and your work. So thanks for having me on.
Oh, likewise. Thank you so much, Caroline, for joining. And one thing that COVID experience and that job that we had, the one good thing, there were a few, but one really good thing that came out of that was meeting you guys. And I think it was a good bunch of people that we were put together. And I'm so glad that I met you guys. I think that's putting a nice bow to this. Thank you so much, Caroline. And I hope it doesn't take another podcast episode. Life is just so busy, isn't it?
Like,
find the time.
If you enjoyed this episode, please consider giving us a 5-star rating so others can find the podcast. Thank you for your company and see you next time.